for holding down the fort these past 2 weeks. Can we give them a round of applause? If you don't know who Gene and Kevin are, they have been a part of this community for 25 plus years. I have been a part of this community under 1 year, and I was 5 years old when they started coming to this community. So they have a lot of years on me, and their messages, their talks were so incredible. I just loved them, and I had the pleasure of actually putting my AirPods in and listening to both of their messages at the gym where I listen to most of my podcast. But there was a split second where I was listening to their messages, and I was thinking, oh my gosh, this sounds like such a cool community. I wish I could be part of something like that. And then I was like, oh yeah, that's right. I do want to clarify one thing, though. Kevin, when he was on stage, he said that he was hesitant to swear because he believed that I never swear. And I was thinking, that's kind of bullshit. But to be honest, I didn't want to follow them. They had such great messages. I didn't want to follow them. So I thought today what I'm going to do is I'm just going to tell a story. And the story that I'm going to tell is something that happened while I was away these past 2 weeks. It's the story of my 30th birthday. And if I'm being really honest, turning 30, there was part of me that thought that I would feel like I had arrived, okay? Like this voice would come down from heaven, the lights would open up, and this voice would say, Jake, you are now a man. When you were 29, you thought as 29-year-olds do, but now you are 30 and you have the wisdom of the world. But I thought, look, I've been here for 3 whole decades, okay? I remember way before streaming, we had TiVo, I remember way before Wi-Fi, we had dial-up. Can you even imagine? Like, how hard is that to even? I remember when The Rock was just a wrestler, okay? And Donald Trump was just a reality TV star. Uh-oh, got quiet. So I had all these expectations of what it was going to feel like to turn 30. And the reality was not lined up with what my expectations were, and that is where this story comes from. And really, in this story of reality not meeting expectations, there were 3 lessons that I learned, and these are lessons that I am excited to share with you today. And this story, like many stories, starts with a plan. And this plan was that me and Olivia were going to take a road trip to San Diego and meet up with some friends of mine who are from Southern California. And I love anyone else like road trips? I love road trips. I don't mind a nice long drive, and I've done it plenty of times. But the thing I have never done, the thing that I did not anticipate, was what it would mean to take a road trip in the heat of the Arizona summer. I did not understand certain things about that. And if you have driven from Tucson to San Diego, what you might remember is that there is a steep incline about 3/4 of the way through the drive, okay? And unbeknownst to me, it's in this mountain pass that many cars overheat every single day. I had no idea. So confidently, I just gun it up this incline, and wouldn't you know it, like many others, our car overheats. It was the little engine that couldn't. So, day before my birthday, we were on the side of the road in the middle of the desert with barely any cell reception, 115 degrees, and no towns 60 miles either direction. Which brings me to the first lesson of today. Reality is never as good as our expectations, but it's often better. See, ahead of any experience that you and I have, we also place some expectations on what that thing might be, what it should be, what we think it ought to be, right? And this is part of what it means to be human. It's actually something we developed in our evolutionary biology, this ability to anticipate And it's something that we don't necessarily share with all of the rest of the animal kingdom. How many of you have pets? And you know that they, as smart and as intelligent as they might be, they don't necessarily have the ability to anticipate like we do. My dog Josie, her favorite thing to do in the world is go to the dog park. But in order to take her to the dog park, we need to put her harness on. And that is the one thing that she will not let us do, which we come after her with the harness and she just runs away. And I'm thinking, help me, help you. I want to do this for you, but she won't let us because she cannot anticipate what comes next. But see, as humans, we can. But it comes with a bit of a problem. And that problem is that with our anticipations, with our expectations, we also have some level of projection that we place on situations as to how they ought to be, how we think they should turn out. Think about your job. How many of you walk into your workplace and there's a feeling of like, things need to be better. This person really ought to be acting this certain way. We do this in our relationships. How many of you look at your partner and there's a little bitty that's like, they really should be doing it that way. Friendships, right? And we really do this when it comes to just our whole life. When we're young, we have these ideas, these expectations about how our life ought to turn out. And yet we have to reckon with the fact that it doesn't always go the way we plan. There's some disappointment. And when we experience that disappointment, that missed expectations, what we tend to do is resist. And in the Buddhist sense, this resistance ultimately turns to suffering. But for those of us who have been on this planet for at least a few years, which I think is all of us, we know that things do not always go according to plan. And this can be true in small ways and in large ways. That in life we can anticipate a certain amount of uncertainty, a certain amount of unpredictability. It's like there's a bit of a chaos baked in to the equation. And yet I've noticed when it comes to my own journey, when it comes to my own growth, I know that the thing that I most need to work on is learning how not to force things to go according to plan, but instead to learn to flow with life. And the ancient wisdom text, the Tao Te Ching, has a really great kind of understanding and way that it articulates this idea of flowing with life. And it's really this encouragement that we emulate water. The Tao Te Ching in verse 34 says this: the great Tao is like a flood. It can flow to the left or to the right. Essentially, it's saying that the great way is not rigid, but it's flexible, it's malleable. It goes on in verse 78 to say, nothing in the world is as soft and yielding as water, yet for dissolving the hard and inflexible, nothing can surpass it. So in some ways, water is the most vulnerable and yet the most powerful substance on the planet. And yet how often is it that when we are faced with unmet expectations, instead of responding like water, we are rigid. We push back. I know that's the feeling that I felt on the side of the road in the desert with my broken down car. I was rigid. I pushed back. I was like, this is not happening. And when we do that, when we respond to life with a sense of rigidity, we get into this standoff with life. We're fighting against life. How many of you have experienced this either within yourself or with others that you know? This feeling of being in a standoff with life, maybe not just for months and years, but maybe a lifetime of fighting against life. And yet what this encouragement from the Tao reminds us is that there is strength in the yielding, that there is power in the surrender, and that water, though it is yielding and bending and flexible, is the most powerful substance on the world. This harkens to what poet John O Donohue says when he says that I would love to live like a river flows, carried by the surprise of its own unfolding. That we might find joy in the surprise. that we might find joy in the unexpected, that we might find joy in letting go of control. But in order to find this type of joy, before we can get there, there's something else that needs to happen. We need to be able to let the old plan go. We need to be willing to let go of our expectations. And in order to do that, there is going to be some amount of grief, because we have to grieve what we thought was going to be. How many of you had dreams about what your career was going to look like when you were young? And maybe you ended up in an amazing career path, but it still wasn't the exact thing that you dreamed. And so there was still a moment where you had to grieve the old plan. Maybe for those of you who have children, as you watch your children grow up, you watch them become their own person. And even if you've learned to love and embrace that person, there was probably still a moment or even a season where you had to come to terms with the fact that that person was not everything that you expected them to be. Friends, what is a plan in your life that you've had to let go of? Now, this is why I say that reality is never as good as our expectations, but it's often better. Because how many memories do you have? How many moments, situations that were meaningful? How many times in your life that inspired growth and transformation? That happened not in spite of uncertainty or challenge, but because of uncertainty and challenge. See, I think that if we were to get everything that we wanted all of the time, that life wouldn't be very interesting, that our growth would become static, and really there would not be any transformation to be had. If you've been with us the last month and a half, we've been going through Joseph Campbell's framework of the hero's journey. And something that really occurred to me in this exploration that we went on together is that the hero's journey is really made possible. The fuel, the drive, the engine of the hero's journey is the difficulty. It's the crisis. It's what we called the cave. And that you really can't hope to have a transformative and meaningful hero's journey if you are unwilling to go through the crisis or the cave or the difficulty. One of my favorite philosophers and spiritual teachers, he's an author named Alan Watts, and he has this thought experiment, this parable that he shares, which I love so much, and it goes like this. Imagine that you are in some sort of heaven-like state where you could create anything you wanted, and you could experience anything you could possibly imagine for an infinite amount of time. And I'm sure some of you are already getting ideas about what yours would be. I know for me, mine would have infinite sushi, just endless sushi, and I could make myself hungry, and I could just keep eating it, and I'd probably fly. I'd probably be able to fly. I'm sure, like some of yours, we shouldn't even be able to share. Some might be a little inappropriate. But Alan Watts asks this. He says, how many days, how many weeks in this situation where you could just create anything you wanted, how many days before that started to lose its novelty? How many weeks, how many months before being fully in control of all of reality would start to lose its luster, would start to become a little boring? How many years until you'd want to experience something that happened that was out of your control? And he says in this parable, imagine, is it 50 years, 75, 100 years before you would create a button? And when that button was pressed, something would happen and you didn't know what it was going to be. In other words, how long until what you would crave was not being in control, but not being in control? What you would want was to be surprised. And he ends with this. He says, ultimately, given enough time, you would end up exactly where you are now, with all of the uncertainty, all of the chaos. You would still choose that. And I believe that in this thought experiment, what he's doing is he's affirming that life is not the most interesting, the most meaningful, the most poignant when everything goes according to plan. but it's actually the most powerful, the most memorable when things do not go according to plan. I think this is why we see an unfortunate number of staggering statistics that the children of the hyper-wealthy often experience an increased rate of mental illness, of mental disorder, which I think goes to show that in life, it's not the absence of challenge that creates a meaningful life, but often it's the presence of challenge. It's the presence of unpredictability. In the Proverbs, there is this verse, 16:9, which says, people do their best making plans for their lives, but the eternal guides each step. And I wonder if what the Hebrew people are saying is that, yes, there is a value in making plans, but the sooner you let go of the how, the sooner you will be able to trust the detours. The sooner you'll be able to trust the unpredictability, surrendering to something larger than just your plan, just your idea. I certainly had a plan for how my trip to San Diego was going to go, but the sooner that I was able to let go of how that happened, the sooner I would be present with what was. And at the moment, what was an overheated car at the side of the road, and here's the thing, I don't know a ton about cars. I don't know if that's obvious based on looking at me. I don't know a ton about cars. But from what little I do know, if your car is overheated, it could be a lot worse to have the AC on. But that's a little bit challenging when it's 115 degrees out. So Olivia and I were starting to panic a little bit. And we were able to get through barely any service. We were able to get a call out to AAA, and luckily they said they were going to be there in just 2 hours. So great, you know. But just when we had start to really kind of give up on hope, a car pulls up next to us. And out of the window peeks out this husband and wife. And I remember the man's voice, and I'll always remember what he said. He said, "What do you need?" He looked at me. He said, "What do you need?" And beyond anything else that would happen that day, I remember in that moment feeling like I wasn't alone. Like this problem, this struggle I was in, I was no longer alone. So out came this man, and I met him, and he started to, he said, "Look, let me help you. I know, probably more about you than cars." So he was like, let's start working. So we started working on our car, and I said, "What's your name?" And he said, "My name's Gabriel." And I was like, "Well, you're my angel Gabriel." And we started. We had popped the hood, and we were working on a car, and I was pretending like I knew what I was doing. I was just like, da-da-da. And we're trying everything. We're pulling things apart. Wires are coming out, and nothing's changing. And so, finally, Gabriel looks at me. He says, "I think we should pray." And I'm thinking, yeah, you're right. And look. Just a disclaimer, if you're new to Aldea, we are a place where we welcome people of a diverse spectrum of faiths, no faith, any kind of, spiritual background is welcome here and supported. But I tell you, that day, I got filled with the Holy Ghost on the side of the road, okay? Gabriel was praying for my engine, and I was like blowing the wind of the Holy Spirit onto the car. I was speaking in tongues. And I just want to do a little side note. I couldn't resist this. So growing up in evangelical Christianity, we had this kind of running joke that if you wanted to do an impression of someone who is speaking tongues, all you needed to say was, "Should have bought a Hyundai." But for those of you who know, I drive a Hyundai Tucson, okay? So that day I should not have bought a Hyundai, okay? And this leads me to the next lesson I learned. Be a good Samaritan, even if it's 115 degrees. See, there was something about that moment when Gabriel and his wife stopped for us, and there was something in me that shifted. I was so inspired, not just grateful, but also inspired, because I thought, I don't want to miss those opportunities in my own life when I can do what he's doing for me right now. And it reminded me that when we are kind, when we are generous, when we rise above ourselves, that it's not just that we help one person, but it starts a chain reaction. Because we help one person and they want to help people, and it goes out from there. It reminds me of what Mother Teresa says when she says that we change the world not necessarily through great things, but with small things done with great love. Now, when it comes to this idea of the Good Samaritan, if you did not grow up in the Christian tradition, you might not know what we're talking about. If you grew up in the Christian tradition, most likely you have heard of this term. And this idea comes from this story in the Gospels. And I just want to set a little bit of background for this story in Luke. See, as often happened in the scriptures, especially when it relates to Jesus, the religious leaders of the day, they would come to Jesus and they would essentially try to trap him. They would try to get him to say things. They'd be like, "What do you believe?" And they'd try to get him to say something that they could essentially use against him. And so this religious leader comes to Jesus and he asks him, "How does one get eternal life?" And Jesus says, "Well, what do the scriptures say?" And this man says, "Well, it says, love the Lord God with all your heart, your soul, your mind, your strength, and love your neighbor as yourself." And Jesus is like, "Well, that sounds pretty good to me." And the man doesn't stop there. He continues to try to trap Jesus, and he says, "Well, then what do you mean when you say neighbor? Who do you say that our neighbor is?" And this is when Jesus goes into this parable. He says, "There once was a man traveling from Jerusalem to Jericho. On the way, he was attacked by robbers. They took his clothes, beat him up, and went off, leaving him half dead. Luckily, a priest was on his way down the same road, but when he saw him, he angled across to the other side. Then a Levite religious man showed up. He also avoided the injured man. A Samaritan traveling down the road came on him. When he saw the man's condition, his heart went out to him. He gave him first aid, disinfecting and bandaging his wounds. Then he lifted him onto his donkey, led him to an inn, and made him comfortable. In the morning, he took out 2 silver coins and gave them to the innkeeper, saying, 'Take good care of him. If it costs any more, put it on my bill. I'll pay you on my way back.'" And then this is Jesus now speaking. "What do you think? Which one of the 3 became a neighbor to the man attacked by robbers?" "Well, the one who treated him kindly," the religious scholar responded. And Jesus said, "Go and do the same." What I love about Jesus' parables, the stories that he tells, is that there's always a bit of subtext to what Jesus is saying. There's the thing being said, and then there's another thing behind what's being said. And in the case of this story, the subtext is found in the characters. See, when it comes to the man who was robbed, we can assume that this was a Jewish man because Jesus was Jewish and he was speaking to a Jewish audience. And when it comes to the 2 men who ignore this man, the priest and the Levite, what we understand is that these were religious leaders in the Jewish community. So these were this man's religious leaders ignoring him, sidestepping him. And yet it is the Samaritan who helps. And what we know about the Samaritans is that they were half Jewish, half Gentile. So people within the Jewish community would have seen them as outcasts. They practiced a different religion. They were of a different ethnic group. And so they were othered by the Jewish community. And what's so fascinating to me is that this story begins with a question of how does one achieve eternal life? And what it ends with is this complete subversion of this idea of who our neighbor is. That our neighbor is not necessarily one who just shares our culture or our creed. No. Those people actually abandon him. Our neighbor is the one who shows us kindness, who rises above to see our common humanity, even if that's a person that you yourself have created an outcast of. Now, what does this have to do with my Hyundai Tucson and 115 degrees on the side of the road? Well, Gabriel and his wife were kind enough to stay with us until the tow truck came. And when the tow truck came, me and Olivia got in, and she said, "Did you realize that Gabriel and his wife were Mormon?" And it instantly struck me with this thought, because growing up in the expression of Christianity that I grew up in, it was a very commonly held understanding that people of the Mormon faith were kind of outcasts. They were not a part of our inner circle. We saw them as other, similar but different. And I resonated so much with this story that in my own life, someone who I may have treated as a Samaritan was the person who stopped for me. I think the only thing that would have made this story a little more similar is if like the Pope drove by in his Pope mobile and was like, nope, not helping. And what's also really profound for me in this moment is that just the day before, I had been invited to a meeting of interfaith leaders in this community, in the Tucson community, and there was, spiritual leaders from the Muslim communities and a Christian scientist and a reverend and a Catholic priest, and there was a spiritual leader from a Mormon community. And it was such a beautiful gathering because it was all these leaders coming together and really going after Jesus' idea of what a neighbor is. Not necessarily someone who shares your exact creed or culture, but someone who can find the common humanity, who can really seek to continually ever expand our idea of what our neighbor is. And so I'd ask you today, who is a Samaritan in your life? Who is someone that you may have unconsciously made a Samaritan? I know this is something that's nearly impossible to avoid in our incredibly polarized political climate. How often we other people who maybe are so much like us, but just because of slight differences, we turn them into something other than human. Can we, like Jesus, redefine our definition of neighbor? Can we see the humanity that supersedes all of it? So, I'm in the tow truck, and they're able to get us to a mechanic, not in San Diego, a little bit outside, but close enough. And the mechanic is not very confident, but he just says, leave it with me, and we'll see what we can do. And so we get an Uber to our hotel, spend the night. It's now my birthday. And, to be honest, my goal was to just try to be able to enjoy my birthday. There was nothing that I could do to fix my car. I just had to let go. But we all know how hard that can be, even when we know there's something we could do to control things. Our anxiety tells us, well, if you worry about this enough, you might change something. But I was able to enjoy my birthday. I'm happy to say I had a lovely birthday despite everything going on. And later that day, I get a call from the mechanic, and he says, look, your car is ready. We did fix it, but I don't, he wasn't sounding super confident. I said, well, would you is it something that you'd try to drive back to Tucson? And he goes, So I had that to go off of. So I'm already thinking, okay, this drive is going to be a bit of a challenge. The next morning, we are reading weather reports, and we are reminded of how this really serious hurricane is headed towards the San Diego coast. And not just that, but we see this chart, and it shows the greatest chance of flooding is not the red, which is San Diego, but it's actually the purple. And the thing about the purple is that this was exactly where we had broken down. So we thought, all right, we probably just want to do one problem at a time. So we decided to drive back on the Saturday night, the Saturday morning, avoid the hurricane altogether, which I'm glad we did, because at that very spot, come to find out, a boulder fell. So trust my intuition on that one. But that entire drive back, Olivia and I were just so anxious. We're like, are we going to make it? Are we going to make it? And then it was a good feeling when we finally did make it. But if I'm being honest, my birthday experience was, let's go back to, just keep your eyes. My birthday experience was one amazing day sandwiched in between two very challenging days, okay? It was kind of like an Oreo if the chocolate part was made out of manure. Which leads me to the final lesson I learned from this experience. Enjoy the moment. There might be a storm coming, okay? Enjoy the moment. There might be a storm coming. How many of us would agree that life contains within it a little bit of everything, right? Thursday, some pain. Friday, joy. Saturday, anxiety. Sunday, peace. Monday, grief, right? Life is a little bit of everything. One phrase that has stuck with me, I've heard it said, is that life is the full catastrophe. There's an author, Jon Kabat-Zinn, a Buddhist meditation teacher, who actually wrote a book called The Full Catastrophe, and he co-opted this term, and he made it something positive. He says, catastrophe here does not mean disaster, rather it means the poignant enormity of our life experience. It includes crisis and disaster, the unthinkable and the unacceptable, but it also includes all the little things that go wrong, that add up. The phrase reminds us that life is always in flux, that everything that we think is permanent is actually only temporary and constantly changing. This includes our ideas, our opinions, our relationships, our jobs, our possessions, our creations, our bodies, everything. Yet our problem is often that when things happen that are out of our control, what we actually fixate on is this illusion of permanence. In other words, when something goes wrong, we think it's going to stay bad forever. This is known, ironically, as catastrophizing, okay? And what we forget is that life is actually constantly in motion. It's always changing, it's always evolving, it's always moving. So even if the present moment is okay, we still get stuck worrying about our past and our future. I want to give you the most direct example that I possibly can. In this room, right now, things are pretty good, right? Like, hopefully temperature's good. You've all been kind of caffeinated. You probably feel good. You're surrounded by people who are nice, I think, for the most part. I know most of you. Things are pretty okay right now, right? And yet, it would be so difficult, if not impossible, for you and I not to bring in some feelings about what's going on outside of this room, some anxiety about the future, some regret from the past. It's so difficult not to imbue the present moment with feelings that we carry about other moments. And what that really does is put us in a difficult place, like our friend Homer Simpson. It puts us between a rock and a hard place. We're stuck between our past, the pain, the regret, the what-ifs, and our future, the fear, the anxiety. And yet Jon Kabat-Zinn goes on to say this: life only unfolds in moments. The healing power of mindfulness lies in living each of those moments as fully as we can, accepting it as it is as we open to what comes next in the next moment of now. In other words, what he's saying is that life can only ever occur in a sequence of the now. That there's just this moment and this moment and this moment. And this idea is illustrated in one of my favorite stories from all of the spiritual traditions, which is saying a lot. I'm sorry, Jesus, but I love this story. This is a story from Zen Buddhism, and it's a story of a monk who is walking along in the forest. And this monk, out of nowhere, is happened upon by a ferocious tiger. And the monk starts to run as fast as he can from the tiger, but he's certainly not as hungry as the tiger, so he is not running as fast until he sees the edge of a cliff, and he realizes it would be better to jump off the edge than to be captured and eaten by the tiger. So he runs towards the edge, and as he jumps, he's able to sort of catch himself and grab onto a vine that is hanging off the edge. So he is now swinging from this vine off the edge of a cliff, and as he looks down, he sees a rushing river with jagged rocks all along the banks. And he realizes that if he were to drop from this vine, it would be certain death. And he looks up and he sees the tiger snarling, waiting for him. And he realizes that if he were to climb back up, it would also be certain death. And yet he looks right in front of him, and on the vine, sticking out, is a beautiful, red, plump strawberry. And though this story is told many different ways, one thing that all the tellings have in common is that they end on this: the ending of the story is this. He looks, he picks the strawberry, he eats it, and it was the most delicious strawberry that he had ever tasted. That sometimes you and I, we feel like we're stuck between a tiger and a rushing river. Sometimes it feels like we're stuck between an overheated car and a hurricane. We all are certainly stuck between the past and the future. And so often we miss that right in front of us there is a beautiful strawberry being waiting to be eaten. And I ask you today, what are your strawberries? What are those things that maybe they're not going to fix all your problems? Maybe they don't heal every situation, but the things that will bring you into this moment, the only place that you can ever really be. What are those things that bring you into the now? I know for me, though there was a lot of chaos on this trip, when I look back, my hope is that what I would remember is what happened on the actual day of my birthday. This is me on the day of my birthday, and I want to remember that in this moment, though the day before was chaos and the day after would be chaos, that hopefully I was able to rise above and to be present in that moment. And I hope the same for all of us, no matter what we face. See, this was not the trip that I had planned, but I wonder if it's more valuable this way. It wasn't what I wanted, but I wonder if it was exactly what I needed. And for all of us, I'd ask this, what are those things in your life that at the time you would not have chosen, but looking back, you would not change? In the moment, you would have said, of course, I would never choose this. I wouldn't wish this on anyone. And then in the future, you say, but if it weren't for that, I wouldn't be where I am now. I'd reckon to say for each of us, there are many moments like that. And so my encouragement to you is next time you are in one of those moments that you just wish you could get out of, remember this. Remember the value it might hold. Remember that there are still strawberries even in that very moment. So Aldea, may we be like water, not rigid when the difficulties come, but flexible, but flowing. May we remember to be a good Samaritan, always expanding our ideas of what our neighbor and who our neighbor is. And lastly, when we feel stuck between our past and our future, would we not forget to notice the strawberries right in front of us?